And hello, and welcome to day 8 of 100 days of Kubernetes. Yay, yay, yay. Today we're going to talk a little bit about exposure, right? And not a bad kind of exposure, a good kind of exposure. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the Kubernetes cluster, and in a diagram much worse drawn than this, we've talked about nodes, and we've talked about pods. What we haven't talked about is these guys, our users, people who actually want to use stuff, right? So right now, we haven't actually talked a lot about how inside of a Kubernetes cluster stuff works, right? Right now, we're magically assuming that different pods can talk to each other inside the Kubernetes cluster. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll explore a little bit more about that as we go forward. We'll get a little bit more into the details. But today I wanted to talk about here, where we want to sit there, we want to talk about our users, and we want to know how the heck do our users get to the Kubernetes cluster, all right? And basically the way that we do this is through exposure, all right? So let's look at exposure and how that works, all right? Well, that's not good. So let's just quickly go over here. Actually, I already have it open. Not sure why. Anyways, okay. So let me make this a little bit bigger and put it in the front here so you guys can all see it. There we go. So exposing an external IP address. So we're not going to go through this as a full tutorial this time. We may do that in the future. But the idea here is why do we need this? All right, so there's a small, okay, I thought it would be a diagram, but there isn't. Okay, that's fine. But basically the reason that we want to have an exposure is because some of our microservices, we actually may want to have, let me go back here. Some of our microservices we may want to have exposed, and some of them we may not, right? So for instance, we may want this pod in this node. We want that one exposed. We want our users to be able to talk to that one. But these two, they're providing services for that pod. The pod should be able to talk to them, but our users shouldn't be able to talk to them. So maybe this one's a database. Maybe this is processing, right? And this is our web server. And we only want our users to sit there and talk to our web server. Now, by default, Kubernetes is very smart, or maybe it's very dumb. And what it does is it limits who can talk to who, right? So basically, by default, I think inside the cluster, inside of the same spot in the cluster, which we haven't talked about too much yet, cluster pods can talk to each other, all right? Now, we can sit there and make it more restrictive. Like, so we could say, like, let's say we had a 3-tier architecture. So we have a web server. We talked about that in the first, right? So we have a web server on this pod. We have an application server here, and we have our database here, right? So what we want is we want everyone to talk to the web server. The web server should only be able to talk to the application server. The application server should only be able to talk to the database server, right? So it would be a very straightforward line of discussion, and where we know where everything goes, and we can sit there and restrict that. But by default, right, the web server can talk to the database server can talk to the application server, but all of them can talk to each other, right? They can't, by default, talk to anybody from outside. They can they can't get traffic from outside, and by default, I think actually they should be able to talk to outside, so they can do things like, go off into Neverland and get some information. So like, let's say they're, you have to sit there and scrape or talk to an API somewhere. We will see there's actually some really cool things about how we can do that. It's going to come up. Okay, so let's do some drawing. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is let's take away this question mark. Of course, it would help if I actually had an eraser instead of a drawing pen, and we'll take this away. All right, so what we want to do is we want to expose this, right? So when we're doing this, what we want to do is we want to sit there. Let's go back here, and we want to connect. Basically, what we want to do is we want to have a way. That's kind of not as good as I had hoped, but it's okay. We want a way to sit there and be able to have the traffic come right into the pod. All right. So there's actually a couple of different ways to do this, right? We can create a service. We can expose an IP. But the end piece of both of these are to actually have a way for outside users to reach us. Generally, inside of the cluster, all of the IP addresses that are inside the cluster are private IPs, right? So this pod can only talk inside of this cluster, or at least it only has an IP to talk inside of this cluster. So while all of the nodes and all of the pods can talk to each other, theoretically, they don't necessarily have a way to be talked to from the outside, right? So the Kubernetes cluster, right, usually it has some communication with something like a virtual machine, right? Here, let me put that in, right? The host OS, right? And so the host OS is what actually has real IP addresses. So when I drew this, like, I don't know, this kind of like thing so that we could get inside, what I'm showing you is that this is the Kubernetes cluster sitting there and allowing something to come through. There's different ways to do this. So there's a few different things. One thing we can do is we can use the port, the API to do a port forwarding. We can use an external IP, and sometimes that would require cooperation from our provider. We can also sit there and lean on the host OS and do some stuff like that. All right. So I'm going to sit there and do a little bit more of a deep dive later, but I just wanted to kind of explain this a little bit to you. The other thing is, if for some of them you're connecting into a specific pod, right, on a specific node. So if this pod was to go down, if I get back to drawing, so if this pod goes down for whatever reason, right, this connection goes down, and basically you're hosed, right? So what you really want is you want to have some kind of an abstraction layer. You want to be able to sit there and do it so that you're not actually dependent on a specific pod, right? That's why we might use something called a service, right? So the service is an abstraction. It just talks to a certain kind of pod type. It doesn't care which pod it is. So like if there's another pod that comes up, hang on, let me do that. If we have another pod that comes up there that replaces that pod, right? The service will just naturally sit there and say, oh, actually this service is supposed to come down in here, right? This guy should come to here and talk to this, right? And boom, you're ready to actually rock and roll. So this is why there is some of this abstraction that we have, and while it can be, there's lots of layers and lots of different things that we can configure and stuff like that. The configurability is the flexibility of Kubernetes, so it helps. All right. So I hope this was a little bit illuminating. Like I said, we're going to get into the dirty details. There's at least 3 methods that I mentioned just casually. So we'll kind of go through. I've actually been able to do a couple of those. I don't know if I mentioned Ingress. Ingress is a specific service. It does kind of cool stuff. It's an abstraction. Services are an abstraction. Port forwards and external exposing external IPs. Those are things that are tied to a specific pod, right? So if your pod goes down, right, you either have to sit there and put this back yourself. So if there are things that you have to do kind of manually, those are better for things like Those are better for things like development and testing and stuff like that. You don't want to sit there and have to do that stuff if in your in your production environment, right? You don't want you want a pod to disappear and to have someone to get up at 3 a.m. and fire up a new pod and adjust all of this stuff, right? You want that to all be done automatically through abstraction and through services or ingress or something like that. We will look at it. Like I said, I hope this is helpful to people. If it is, click like, and we will continue the journey. I hope to see you again soon, and have a nice night.